Willkommen zur 177. Ausgabe von Europe Calling.
Welcome very much to the 177th edition of Europe Calling. Today, in cooperation with the ECI Campaign, the European Association for the Promotion and Support of European Citizens Initiatives. And Carsten Berg is the one representing them. My name is Maximilian Fries. I'm the Managing Director of Europe Calling. And first of all, I would like to welcome particularly our discussion guests here. I'll be introducing them individually when it's their turn to speak. First of all, I'd like to let you know how we will take you through the day. We will start with 4.5 presentations from Kikou on the cage age initiative, then James Kanter, a journalist and the podcast founder of EUScream, Nina Holland and Carsten Berg. And then we'll have time to take your questions. You can also submit your questions already. The QR code takes you to Slido where you can upload your questions and also rate them. We have 1,700 participants and we need to somehow select the most relevant questions that we will take up here. Please use a name when posting your questions because it's not very nice to be raising the questions from an unknown user. Europe Calling will be recorded tonight and then afterwards uploaded on YouTube and made available online as a podcast, and you can hear it in either of the languages again. And that's my short introduction. That was all I wanted to say by ways of housekeeping, and we'll start with the topic. And we will be speaking about the European Citizens Initiative to end the cage age and the question of the influence of livestock and agro-industry on animal welfare policy. That's very important with the view to reflecting also on the European Citizens Initiative as a tool for the European citizens. Those of you who know a number of webinars of Europe Calling know that we follow two strands, EU of the future and power of the people, or power to the people rather. And this time, tonight, we combine the two strands. I have already explained to you what we will be talking about. Let me also tell you that we invited the European Commission, of course, the president or the competent commissioners, but unfortunately they weren't available. But we did receive a statement saying more impact assessments were needed. How to interpret this will also be addressed by our guest speakers. So we did try to invite them. I would like to leave that to our guests to comment on. As a team, I would like to introduce now Olga Kikou, head of the EU Office of Compassion in the World Farming, and she brought her attorney along. Thomas Hieber, who specializes on the Citizens Committee of the End of Cage Age ECI. Olga.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I will go ahead and share my screen and and here we are. I need to find the share. Here it is. Let me just. There it is, and I need to just change the. Okay. Okay. I hope you see everything now. Very nice to be here, and I'm really glad to be able to present to you today the cage age ECI and the case and what happened in the past, where we are now, and what's going to happen in the future. So quite some years ago, several, well, actually it was many organizations came together to basically to demand an end to the use of cages in animal farming, which is a practice very, very common in the EU, in all countries in the EU, and for a number of species of animals. So overall, over 300 million animals are farmed in the EU in cages. And of course, cages cause a lot of suffering to animals. Many species are farmed in cages, and citizens want an end to it. In that journey, we used the European Citizens Initiative, the tool to enhance participatory democracy. And after a long process where we gathered signatures, we presented we made the case for the end the cage age ECI, etc. We finally came to June 10th of 2021, when the European Parliament voted a resolution, a historic resolution, basically calling for an end to cages and very much supporting the ECI with an overwhelming majority. Following that, a few days later, at the end of June of 21, the Commission made an unprecedented commitment to adopt the legislative proposal, to present a legislative proposal banning the use of cages in the EU. For us and all those who joined us, it was a year, 2021 was a year of hope. The ECI managed to surpass the minimum threshold of 1 million signatures. It was the 6th ECI to finish, to surpass this threshold, and the one and only ECI with a clear commitment from the European Commission to deliver its goals. Following that, the Commission, in preparation for the proposal, embarked on a series of consultations, started to prepare for the legislation, asked the European Food Safety Authority for scientific opinions, conducted many interviews with stakeholders, and in general started preparing for the proposal. And from 21, we come to 23, fall of 23, when we described, when we started describing the year as a year of broken promises. The proposal to end the use of cages that was actually included, it was supposed to be included in a package of proposals for higher animal welfare standards. It was proposals on animal welfare. The whole package was actually derailed. The proposal specifically about cages was never presented. And out of that, the 4 proposals that were promised, only one made it at the end of the year, and that was a proposal on animal transport. If we also look at what happened with many of the other proposals in the Farm to Fork strategy, we see that many were either not delivered or when delivered, they were significantly weakened. So we had high ambition in the beginning, and then we ended up actually lowering the ambition quite significantly. During this period, we saw a vicious attack by industry, big meat lobby industry, to attack on science. For example, the conclusions of the European Food Safety Authority were called basically were described as not impartial, that there were serious scientific errors. We saw a lot of propaganda around animal farming, presenting very, very different pictures from reality. We saw also in the process diversion tactics. Many started talking about the Ukraine war, and there were alarmist voices talking about food security issues around, increased animal welfare standards. And we also saw how the industry discredited, or at least attempted to discredit voices of dissent, including us campaigners, but also journalists. We were called, one of the usual attacks is that we are called emotional or troublemakers. And in September of last year, when the proposals were actually supposed to be presented, we saw the president, actually the Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, basically reiterating the arguments of the industry and calling for more dialogue, calling for less polarization, and no word about the proposals. At the same time, we also, around that time, we also conducted an analysis of the voting records of MEPs from various political groups in regards to animal welfare. We examined 16 votes, important votes for animal welfare and also animal farming. And we saw that the European conservatives in general were the ones who were least likely to support animal welfare when these files were up for a vote. You can see here the percentages, which are very indicative of the trend. So where are we now? We have basically, over the years since the ECI the ECI tool started to be used, we have over 100 ECIs that have been registered. 10 of them actually surpassed the threshold of 1 million signatures. Half of them are dedicated to animals, and only one of the so-called successful ECIs that surpassed the threshold, only one, has so far received a clear positive commitment from the European Commission, and this is the End the Cage Age ECI. But we see nothing in reality, no commitment. The commitment has not materialized, which actually puts the entire ECI instrument in jeopardy. It makes it in a way void. There are treaty obligations which are ignored here, and the future of the ECI instrument is questioned. In addition, we have a serious issue here that there is a loss of trust in EU institutions if actually they start backing down on commitments that have been made. On the other hand, we see how citizens, and this is one of the questions in the latest Eurobarometer poll that was actually published in October of last year, just a few months ago, and we see here how citizens and across Europe in all countries, how the vast majority of citizens want animals to be raised, not to be kept in cages. And the percentages range from 80 to 95%, which is a huge percentage for this question. So I am going to go directly to the end of this presentation and to focus on the next steps. And right now, we have the European elections coming up in just a few months from now. We count on EU citizens to make sure that democracy will work. We want people to participate in the EU elections, and we want people to make informed choices. So when they go to the ballot box, we want them to know about the candidates, to know about the political groups, to make sure that they are aware of the people who support their issues. We as citizens are going to, and as civil society organizations, we are going to inform the new politicians following the EU elections about the KJ, GCI, and we are going to follow up with many of the actions we have in our campaign work regarding the ECI and what needs to be done. We are also looking at different options, including legal action, in order to make sure that the Commission actually keeps its word and keeps its promises, not just promises, but also commitments. And this is it from me. I tried to make this a very short presentation, and I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Super, Olga. Vielen Dank. Das war ein sehr guter Einstieg. Und jetzt, wie schon gesagt, gehen wir zu deinem Anwalt.
Thank you, Olga. That was a great start. Let's continue with your attorney, Thomas Hieber, so the ECI attorney. And Olga hinted at that. Legal action might be taken. So now that'll be interesting to hear what Thomas has to say about that. Good evening. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Maximilian. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to provide you with my ideas about the issue. Now, I've worked for the ECI for a number of years now. I'm happy to contribute whatever I can. Now, as to the debate that Olga has enlarged upon, I can say that this is rather exceptional. And in many ways, it's unprecedented what we see here. Now, for nearly 30 years now, we've seen citizens using the European Citizen Initiative, getting them underway, asking the Commission to come up with legal proposals on issues that citizens feel are important. Now, looking back on those 13 years, our initiative, and KJ was the only initiative, the only one to which the Commission pledged, yes, we will take it on board. And I think this speaks volumes. Well, what I have to say very clearly as well is that this is a legally binding commitment. Legally binding, it's mandatory what the Commission promised. So once the Commission said yes, we will go for that. This went hand in hand with the timeline. They said that by the end of the last quarter of 2023, the initiative would have been completed, would have been implemented. Now, 2.5 years have passed, and quite frankly, the Commission has been dealing with this initiative for even longer. And as Olga explained, nothing happened. No steps were taken, although the Commission, under legal requirements, must take action within a certain time frame, by a certain deadline, but nothing happened. Probably trying to, just ignore things and, sit and twiddle thumbs, or they might come up with excuses why they can't get ahead with these files, or why they can't take them on board yet. Very little plausibility behind these excuses, of course. Now, the members of the Citizens Committee, the organizational board, if you like, of the initiative, well, let's say we're wondering in what way to deal with the situation. In the rules, the rule book on how to implement the ECI, the case that we're facing now, the situation we're dealing with, is not even foreseen, it's not even mentioned. There are no regulatory rules or anything because the Commission probably never thought they would come into that situation. They will have to, under the rule of law, under the regulations, they must keep to what they promised. But this cannot be a status quo we could live with. The members of the committee of the ECI, well, they have only one option to insist on that ECI to be implemented, that is to take legal action. To that end, the members of the Citizens Committee decided to ask the Commission to take measures, to take action. But they're still waiting for a reply by the Commission. So once we have the reply, we'll see where this is going to take us, the direction they want to go to. In any case, I'd like to stress that the committee does not sit and twiddle thumbs. We'll take every action, every measure that is needed to make sure that the legal provisions are adhered to. And Olga has explained as well that we're afraid that the instrument, the tool of European citizens' initiatives will suffer from the situation. Let me explain this. In order to successfully implement such an initiative, that is to collect 1 million and more signatures, it takes years and years of preparation of resources. It's very time and resource consuming to embark upon such an adventure. This project is something that people will shy away from if they can't be sure that at the end of all their work, at the end of the day, the Commission will adhere to, will follow the rules and stick to its promises. So this is a very basic issue. And the cage age, with this initiative, the Commission has become more reticent in what they say. So their willingness to commit to something has gone down because they're afraid of legal action. So they become careful, which is our impression. So to avoid that, the European Citizens' Initiative, being one of the most important, most basic democratic rights, will be null and void and useless. That is an issue that means that we need to take action, even legally. And I'm sure that Carsten Berg will be saying more about that. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Thomas. Das nochmal mit den rechtlichen Aussichten.
Thank you very much, Thomas, with this outlook on the legal situation. I look forward to a reaction from the European Commission, certainly not the first letter. The next guest speaker is James Kanter, a journalist and founder and editor of the EUScream podcast. It's in the English language, but it's really worthwhile your time. He worked for a long time for the International Herald Tribune and the New York Times and reported on climate change and the EU integration. And he's been inter alia awarded the Reporting Europe Prize. He has gained huge insight into the lobbying designs and policies that are present in Europe, or rather in Brussels, and we look forward to your contribution, James.
Okay, thank you, Maximilian, for having me on this evening. It's a real pleasure to be invited, including seeing familiar faces among the panel. I'll try and stick to 8 minutes. As Olga says, last year was not just a big win for big meat, but also for industrial farming across the board in Europe. And what really interested me about working with the expert journalists at Lighthouse Reports, which led the investigation that I was part of, it was the way they turned up new details, including audio recordings, which is great for podcast, of course, about how this push by industrial farmers has a transatlantic dimension to it. And the recordings that we got hold of and the interviews we did, they show how public relations, journalism, the culture wars, and science are all mixed up in this push to slow down or even stop the kind of overhaul of our agri-food systems that EU officials and parliamentarians had agreed to as a result of the ECI, the European Citizens Initiative. I began my episode, which I called Big Meats, Big Win in Europe. I began this episode of the podcast with the voice of a lobbyist / campaign manager from a group called European Livestock Voice. This group, Livestock Voice, is basically modeled on a group called Carni Sostenibili, Sustainable Meats, which was developed in Italy a few years ago. But Livestock Voice is a much more ambitious iteration of that, and its founders, or at least its founding members, are among the really big agri-industry players in Brussels. And they include, of course, the big farm lobby group, Copa Cogeca. Now, European Livestock Voice has also appeared at the website for something called the Protein Pact. That's a big promotional project run by the North American Meat Institute. And by the by, that American Institute has been called out for still questioning the degree to which human activity is responsible for climate change. And indeed, as I said earlier, what seemed particularly noteworthy were the US contacts that this campaign manager at Livestock Voice was exploring with public relations folks based in Washington and meat industry groups. So the narrative I put together starts in May last year at a conference in Virginia in the US of the Animal Agriculture Alliance. And it's there in Virginia at a conference that our campaign manager for Livestock Voice tells the audience in his presentation that he's been, quotes, an environmental journalist for 18 years, how that's still his official identity, but how his real job now is to work to inform the public about livestock production. And he's doing that via European Livestock Voice, which is this communications project based in Brussels. And it's also at this conference in Virginia that he lays out the plan for 2023. This year in particular, he says, we're all focused on Brussels and on the revision of the animal welfare legislation. They were doing an entire communication strategy that year, focusing on animal welfare. And later in an online Q&A for the conference, he lays out what's at stake for the meat industry on both sides of the Atlantic. He writes that, quote, in the EU at the moment, the key policy battle is surely the one on animal welfare. But in general, a very good point is continuing to monitor what is going on in Europe to avoid that the same thing can happen in the US too, from a legislative perspective. So long story short, it's via this conference that we can see this transatlantic cross-fertilization, if you like, of livestock campaigning. And there's certainly evidence of the keen interest in importing this American-style playbook. And it's a playbook that journalists in the US say involves shutting down criticism of the factory farm industry, in particular by putting animal welfare initiatives in the same basket as extremism. And indeed, the title of the session that our campaign manager from Livestock Voice was speaking at in Virginia was titled, quote, Responding to Animal Rights Extremism in 2023. So for my part, I was particularly interested in the discussion at the conference about the media techniques that were being used by the livestock industry in the US. It's an approach that was being laid out at the conference by a guy from a fairly well-known Washington, D.C. PR firm called Berman & Co. And that's to use films and videos and social media postings to imply an equivalency between the ruinous problems of industrial farming as laid out by Olga, and any allegations whatsoever against those who are objecting to industrial farming. The guy from the DC PR firm tells the audience, referring to animal welfare advocates, that it's time to put them on defense. They're the ones that should be answering the questions, not you. They're the ones that should have to explain themselves, not you. You, the farmers, you are feeding the world. And it's in response to this that our European Livestock Voice campaign manager says that he's very inspired by what he's heard from the PR guy from Berman and Co., and how he wants to bring similar lobbying tactics across the Atlantic, basically to the heart of the EU. Now, another element I want to highlight from our reporting is science. Science has, of course, been a controversial but key part of industry lobbying for a really long time. And it's often involved cherry-picking data to try and minimize the impact on health or the environment that any industry might be having. You know, think tobacco, cars, even social media. They've all used these techniques, but nowadays there seems like there's another big tactic that's emerging, and that's to recruit large numbers of scientists and in particular industry-funded researchers and academics to sign up to sort of support your industry sector. And that's certainly been a big part of the livestock sector's strategy in the last couple of years, including European Livestock Voice. And this is particularly through a document that's called the Dublin Declaration on Livestock. And that has something like close to 1,000 signatories, and it's frequently talked about by European Livestock Voice. In his remarks in Virginia, our campaign manager for European Livestock Voice makes this push to use science and scientists pretty clear in terms of his strategy. He says that his future strategy, so think 2024, is, quotes, to make the next step from defensive practice to questioning. I'd like to go to the scientists, the ones publishing papers against meat, and say to them, why are you saying that? What's your data? Fact. So he says, that's the next step. Now, there's a lot more to say about the investigation that EUScream did with Lighthouse Reports, and you can get more from the full article at the Lighthouse Reports website, and of course from listening to the full podcast. That episode features Thin Lei Win from Lighthouse, Arthur Neslin from The Guardian, Olga from Compassion in World Farming, and Sylvia Lazaris of Food Unfolded. Sylvia's work unpicking the conflicts of interest around the signatories of the Dublin Declaration, that's particularly interesting. And let me just say this in my closing remarks. We also had the opportunity, I should say, to interview this campaign manager for European Livestock Voice. He's a very, very experienced guy. He's an author. He's written a book in defense of meat. He's super smart on how media shapes our food choices. Anyway, I thought his agreeing talking to us was, something of a good sign for the way that we can at least talk openly about all of these issues. And okay, he stuck to his guns on the way the meat industry chooses to use science. He also stuck to his guns on yet another aspect of all of this that I find very interesting, which is the way that the meat industry asserts that advocates of plant-based diets are waging a kind of culture war on traditional ways of eating, and how all the talk of climate crisis stirs undue anxiety in kids. But while he kept insisting that European Livestock Voice as an entity does not engage on a policy level, which is not quite true actually, he also made another really important concession, that his organization, Livestock Voice, which is basically a lobbying outfit, probably should be on the EU's transparency register. And that was something that they were finally looking into. So at least that's something to look out for. I'll wrap up there. You can find the full podcast at EUScream or on Spotify or at Apple Podcasts. And I'll put those links in the chat, so anyone should be able to access them. Thanks again. I look forward to hearing from the other speakers.
Super, vielen Dank. Link habe ich sogar schon gepostet für
Great,
alle.
thank you very much. I've just posted a link. That podcast really is very interesting, especially what's happening across the Atlantic. Now, Nina Holland will pick up the ball. We really will enlarge upon this. Nina Holland, Corporate Europe Observatory, it's the NGO really dealing with industrial lobbying and the taking of influence on politics. She's a researcher. This NGO helps understand what's happening there behind the screens. 16 years now. Nina's been with CEO for 16 years, so she is the expert. Wouldn't know of anybody who's more experienced. So good to have you, Nina.
Thank you very much, Max. And it's been already fascinating to hear all the parallels with our work on pesticides and seeds from the previous speakers. It's been remarkably similar experience. So maybe you could start showing the slides, Max. Is that possible?
Moment. Carmen. Second.
So while this is in process, maybe I...
It's in process, yeah, exactly. Yeah. There we go.
As you explained, Max, the CEO is a lobby watchdog organization based in Brussels, and we work on different themes. So we're just a few people working on agribusiness and chemicals, but we have other teams working on the oil industry or the finance industry. So you can find more about that on our website. Next slide, please. Olga also talked about the ECIs that have already been taken place, and that there is currently 10 successful ECIs. 2 of them, and so many of them, that is amazing, are on animals. 2 of them are on pesticides that we were also involved with. If you could just move to the next slide, please. I don't see it yet, but maybe you do. But what is interesting about it, what I just wanted to mention is that, right, doesn't matter. From the first 2 ECIs, the ban glyphosate and the Save Bees and Farmers, both of them demand a reduction of pesticides. So what they've done is they really contributed to the Green Deal and to the thinking behind the Green Deal. It's also been said explicitly many times by Vice President Timmermans, for instance, formally, that the ECIs were really instrumental in supporting, strong, ambitious reduction targets. From the ban glyphosate ECI, you could say, well, glyphosate has still not been banned, but there were more demands, and actually one entire law has been overhauled to make all the safety studies on all products that are regulated, including pesticides, but also food additives, for instance, should be made completely public. Previously, they were not. The raw data of the safety studies were not public, so that made it very difficult to challenge them. So just to indicate that ECIs really can have a big impact. So the Green Deal, yeah, finally, some positive proposals on the table, it seemed. We were all very hopeful. The farm-to-fork reduction targets on antibiotics, on fertilizer, pesticides. There would be a REACH revision on chemicals, potential ban on the export of chemicals that are banned already in the EU. We would have a food systems law, nature restoration law, biodiversity strategy, and of course the animal welfare proposals and a boost of organic farming. So this all sounded very good. Obviously, this was immediately met with a very strong counteraction by the industry. They were, of course, being subtle about it. This is about the ECIs. They were being a bit subtle about it. Several lobby groups actually changed their name to sound nicer, like the Crop Protection Association, the pesticide lobby, changed their name to CropLife Europe, which sounds a lot nicer. They tried to reinvent themselves. They all said, and they kept
Sorry,
saying,
Nina.
Yeah.
Nina, are you telling me to skip to go to the next slide, because I'm swimming a bit, so you need to give me a sign somehow.
Yes, you can move to the next slide. Yes. I'm just talking a bit over them. Yes, you can move to the next slide.
Okay, there we go.
Yes. So this is an indication of the lobby power. This is the firepower of just the chemicals industry. This is really just the minimum data that we get from the EU Transparency Register, which is just the self-declared figures by the industry. So these numbers are vast underestimates. You need to take that into account. But with these resources, they were able to really mobilize against the different parts of the Green Deal. But for the first time, they were on the defensive. So they had to really change their strategy in order to face all these different proposals. And a big part of these strategies came down to delaying effects, make all sorts of obstructions. An interesting transatlantic element of this was that the US started a sort of anti-farm to fork coalition involving agribusiness, industry, and also other foreign governments to lobby the EU, because indeed they were very afraid of what the EU would do, and that would then come to other countries, that other countries would follow. And of course, promoting their own techno-fix solutions, all with a view to keep business as usual, to not change really the way that agriculture is done. And a very important element, which does not feature on this slide, but an important element is, of course, to really keep the farm lobby in a stranglehold. So to really capture the farm lobby, and the leadership of the farm lobby is only too willing to do that, to act in line with their interests. And we see that very strongly with pesticides, that the farm lobby will always come out in favor of the use of each and every pesticide, no matter how harmful it is to the users. So one of our reports in 2020 was precisely about this, about how basically showing how the farm lobby, the leadership doesn't seem to really represent the interests of most farmers, maybe only the 20% biggest farmers, the most industrialized farmers. They get the most subsidies, so they favor an unequal spending of the farm subsidies, but also regarding other topics like climate change or pesticide use, they are really not on, advocating for the interest of long-term of farmers. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, what they did was call for more impact assessment. We've already heard it. It's a very old strategy. They used it decades ago. They used it in the last time that the chemical legislation was discussed. They said, oh, with this legislation, all the industry would relocate. Well, the legislation came and nobody relocated. So they, various of these lobby outfits ordered impact studies, not peer-reviewed science or anything, but just papers from, for instance, universities like Wageningen in the Netherlands or Kiel in Germany. This was coordinated. So Copa-Cogeca, as part of European Livestock Voice platform, ordered one from Wageningen, and CropLife Europe for pesticide industry ordered another from the private branch of the Wageningen University. And these were all publicized at the same time. So here you see a leaked slide from Copa-Cogeca strategy, how they were going to use the studies. You see the red square in the middle, publication of studies. That was the key moment to tackle, to attack the farm to fork strategy with all the different elements in it, from pesticides to animal welfare legislation. Next slide. We also had a leak from CropLife Europe. And I think you see it in the next slide, which was very interesting. And they also, it's more difficult to see, but in the top right corner, you see that they speak about amplifying these different studies from Wageningen University and quote, to build surround sound and pressure. So that means you have different studies from different universities. Okay, it's not science, but doesn't matter. You have different lobby outfits. You invite the authors from these universities to come and speak, and then so you create a variety of voices, an echo chamber, surround sound. And this, they hoped, would, among other things, influence a resolution in the European Parliament on farm to fork. This was all revealed. So these leaked papers came out. We wrote about it. It was in the media. MEPs got very angry. So at that moment, it was not fully effective because the Parliament still supported mandatory reduction targets, for instance. So it was not fully successful yet, but they kept banging the same beat. They repeated these studies at the national level. We found German studies, a Polish one, a Slovenian one. Who knows in which other countries they did the same. Next slide. And finally, also they had an effect in this, for instance, on pesticides. In December 22, the Council, so the member states, forced the Commission to do more impact data. That caused a 6-month delay till June. And that was a crucial time that the pesticide law should have advanced. In the meantime, using, again, the food security argument, the Ukraine war, over and over again, abusing also these crises very much, they managed to basically create a dynamic of more and more critique until the moment where the EPP, the Conservative Party, basically started to get into election mode. They are very afraid that they will lose votes to the extreme right, following also the farmer protests. So they become the extreme right. So they shift to the right, become purely anti-environmental, and they were bound on killing the nature restoration law and then the pesticide reduction law. The first one they didn't quite manage because they themselves hyped it so much in the media that there was a lot of backlash, but it was severely weakened. However, with the pesticide reduction law, basically it was blocked in the European Parliament in an unprecedented way. Next slide. I hope it works. Right, I have to, yeah, can I go one back? I just would like to show this slide, this image, because it shows on the left you have an event, a corporate-sponsored event by Euractiv about the pesticide impact study by CropLife on the 12th of October 21. And on the right you see 1 day later, it's the European Livestock Voice event with a researcher from Wageningen and Kiel. And it said in the announcement, this webinar complements the Euractiv event supported by CropLife on the 12th of October. So this really shows the coordinated level between the different issues and just this overall attack on all the farm to fork files. Yes, last slide. I'm really running over time. I'm sorry for that. So what is left of the Green Deal? Many files have been weakened, stalled, pushed off the table, are in a coma, like the pesticide reduction law, the SUR. And we're now heading to the elections. And already von der Leyen has announced a strategic dialogue on food and farming. And immediately Kopa-Kožeka jumped on it. And it's very unclear what exactly is happening. But you can be sure that the fate of what happens to the Green Deal under the next Commission is already being decided and developed as we speak, and pressure is being put on the next 5 years. And of course, it would be extremely dramatic for biodiversity, for animals, for climate, if no follow-up, if the Green Deal would be completely defeated and would have no follow-up. And therefore, both the EU elections are very important. As a CEO is concerned, we really want to step up in challenging the legitimacy of corporate lobbies and their influence on not only the EU institutions, but also national governments. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Nina. Du hast jetzt nochmal das Netz.
Thank you very much, Nina. You really broadened the perspective and also mentioned the Green Deal, and we talk about much more than animal welfare. Of course, we also need to consider the question of democracy in Europe. Carsten Berg of the ECI campaign will certainly take up this issue. Because we have heard already that 5 of the successful ECIs concerned subjects that are being blocked now somewhere. And that is a problem, a democratic problem, and also a problem for European citizens' initiatives. And that's why I'm very happy to welcome Carsten Berg and perhaps look into the future and do some forward thinking. Thanks very much, Max, and thank you for this organization. I really have huge respect for what you really organize and the level of Europe calling. Our organization, ECI Campaign, really emanated from the European Convention. It just did not happen by itself, but it really rose out of a very intensive dialogue of all those pro-democracy movements 20 years ago. And we now support ECIs. We offer campaign advice. We help them organize the fundraising. We give legal advice because it's a huge, it's a huge and very demanding initiative. If you want to organize an ECI, you need at least 100,000 euros. It's the most complex initiative process in the world because you need 1 million signatures in round about 27 different member states. So you have to organize up to 27 different ECI campaigns. And Olga has organized it in an exemplary way. And we really congratulate you once more on your great achievement. We have accompanied you throughout all the years and now are still active with documenting what's happening. There's no transformation without implementation, and that really must be the next step in the democracy, where we simply accompany the implementation. It is something that was left aside in the Constitutional Convention 20 years ago. And if we are now considering a treaty change in the European Union, we certainly need to deepen the possibilities for the European Citizens Initiative. Max, I sent you a presentation. Perhaps you could open it, because I would like to pick up 2 individual topics before we come to the debate. Where are we today in the ECI? Just some empirical data. And I would also like to identify the political scandal in this whole context and what we would require by ways of a treaty reform. You've heard it from Olga. Since 2012, when the tool was first offered, 128 ECIs were registered. 10 were successful, which means that they collected more than 1 million signatures. 18 million signatures were collected and 10 ECIs are still ongoing. There's only one which is perhaps moving forward quite promising. Tax the Rich is the title of this ECI. Taxing the rich would also mean that the wealth would be redistributed because wealth is not very evenly spread throughout Europe, put it that way. Perhaps we can have the next slide, please. We have 10 successful ECIs, and I can repeat what Nina already said. Most of them concerned animal welfare. The first initiatives were quite diverse, ban glyphosate, for example, and the One of Us initiative or the right to water. And then we had a number of animal welfare initiatives, and they were rather successful. On the next slide, you will see what was really important for the ECIs was the fact that there was no implementation of the successful ECIs. That really caused the crisis situation. Of course, you cannot expect that it will be transposed one-to-one, because an ECI with 1 million signatures is still a minority initiative, which only asks the European Commission to take up the issue and to position itself. And I can see the questions of Vladimir Rotten in the chat and in the questions and answers. It is not mandatory, but the European Commission needs to position itself. And that is where we have a real problem. And in the case of the cage age, they have positioned themselves very clearly and have not implemented it. There are two others that have been partially implemented, but only concerning their secondary objectives and not their primary objectives. On the next slide, we see that the European Commission committed itself to implementing the ECI and the cage age. But it's a real legal breach and a political breach also. It is a real problem how the European Commission reacted, and we can no longer expect that anything will be implemented. So the ECI really has entered into its deepest crisis since its inception almost 12 years ago. And as organizations defending democracy, we joined forces amongst about 70 organizations, Stop Vivisection, Stop First, the water initiative. We joined forces and asked the European Commission to follow suit on its commitment to implement this ECI. Because in principle, we also need to reform the ECI. It has become very, very clear that we need some urgent action, but the European Commission simply carries on as usual, has not reacted, has not replied to the letter, has not joined us here to have this dialogue. And the European Commission is not immune against corporate lobbies and the influence of corporate interests. Are they the victim of the big meat? I would say yes. The ECI is indeed, and perhaps the democratic processes are not strongly enough developed within the European institutions. We really need to bring them and anchor them very firmly at the EU level. So something needs to change. Let me go to my last slide, please. I can see three very important things that we need to do. Of course, we need to do everything in our power to continue having such webinars as we have it now, to have such wonderful podcasts as James produces them, to continue working like Nina and her team do, in order to continue the dialogue with Ms. von der Leyen, with the Commission President, in order to implement the ECI and the cage age. The damage has already been done, but we must mitigate the knock-on effects. And we also have a second demand, and that is to push for a deeper and more meaningful reform of the ECI, because it's one of our democratic rights, and it should really be an initiative that we can take to the legislator. It does not mean that it'll be implemented one-to-one, but it'll have to be taken up, and the European Parliament will have to vote on it, and also the Council will, of course, need to decide on it. We've always had a filter in practice before, so we need the direct approach. And the ECI itself was not a gift to us. It really came about as the result of a very strong battle by the pro-democracy movement. So the next step must be that all these ECIs, Save Bees and Farmers, and the cage age, water is a human right, this is something that appealed to millions and millions of people, but now they suffer from the weaknesses of the entire system. And that is why we need a reform of the ECI, and not in the least a reform of the treaties. We really do need a deep reform of democracy in Europe, and the ECI will be very important in this context. We really need a reform process that should be launched bottom up to reform our treaties. And we should also work at submitting proposals which can be used in any country, because in some countries, the sovereigns will have to vote on those pieces of legislation. And I hope that we can deepen this debate in the near future. Some parliaments have been very open to it, but it's very good that the European Parliament opened the way for a reform process. That was my input.
Thank you, Carsten. Thanks to all of you. Now, looking at the questions, we have questions for German and English, different rooms. So what I'll do is the following. I'll pick out a number of questions, those who've been voted up, been voted by a number of people, and then I'll just say, look, raise your hand, whoever wants to respond here from the panel. Don't hesitate, raise your hands. You don't have to say something on every question, but if you feel you have something to say, you'd like to answer a question, do raise your hands. And if there's some time left, I'd be happy to have people from the audience ask questions. Andrea Posekel. Her question is,
participation and the serious consideration of the proposals. Also, wie vielleicht mal der erste Teil dieser Frage.
So the first part of the question, pressure exerted by the lobby group. They've been successful in exerting pressure. So what do you think could be measures, could be action we could take to prevent that, or at least to create a level playing field? So what's your take on that, Olga?
Unmute, yeah.
Yes, well, lots of things can we can do lots of things. First of all, we need to increase transparency, and we need to make people realize how some of these lobbies work. The work of James Kanter and many other journalists and also media platforms is very, very important and needs to be supported because they expose the ways of the industry, and they expose the lies. It's also important that we as citizens hold our representatives to account, and we hold them responsible when they are not keeping their promises, they're not keeping their commitments. That's why we have a good tool in our hands, and this is the elections. We live in democracy, in European democracy, and democracy is at stake when we have big businesses operate like this against citizens, but also representatives who are supposed to represent the citizens who vote them into these institutions like the European Parliament, for example, when they actually act against the interest of their own citizens. Therefore, I mean, these are only a few of the things that we can do, but yeah, I'll let Nina also say a few words.
Thank you, Olga. Nina.
Yes, I would say this is more than the $1 million question. This is the question of power and how do we improve the democratic system in the EU, which we often call, do we live in a democracy or in a lobbyocracy? We have a lot of proposals regarding the regulation of lobbying, which hardly is being regulated. We have some transparency rules. There are some rules, what is corruption, what is not corruption. There are some limits to gifts and things like that, but it's minuscule. We need to look at the entire system of revolving doors, conflicts of interest. Basically, just when a new advisory group is being set up, the Commission puts out a call, and who ends up in that advisory group depends on who responds to this call. Who responds? It's the lobby groups from corporations, because they are always in the majority. They have the most resources. And of course, that is a matter of design, that the Commission could do that, set it up in a different way. They could themselves have rules on who they give a space in these groups. So lobbying should be regulated, and we want to go even further when it is about issues that are crucial to democracy or to the environment, like climate or pesticides. We really argue for strong firewall against corporate lobbying. When you see that the extent to which the oil industry is able to be on the table in climate negotiations at the UN level, or sponsor debates at the EU level, we think that should simply no longer be allowed. Politicians should refrain from attending such debates. And yeah, we want to challenge the normalcy, how accepted it is that these corporate lobbyists have a say in every platform. We want to challenge that. And we want to bring that also very clearly into the EU elections as a theme.
Danke dir. And Carsten?
Thank you very much, Carsten.
As Nina said, the $1 million question here, which we cannot answer directly, but indeed, I think this is a clear power question, and we need to look, of course, as it was said, into transparency and lobby registrations and all these very important questions. But this does not replace yet the power sharing question. I think also elections is not sufficient. I agree with you. We should fully exhaust the power of the elections. But ultimately, we also know that the European Parliament is the only democratic parliament in the world that does not have an own right of initiative, right? So also the power of the parliament is still reduced. I think we should really strive to increase the power of the parliament. And then I'm convinced that we need to complement the existing traditional representative democracy with new democratic innovations beyond the ECI, building on the ECI. That means, on the one hand, I would love to see the ECI combined with randomly selected citizens' assemblies, because randomly selected citizens do not have the incentive to be re-elected, and they are also, in that sense, also less vulnerable for corporate lobbying. Of course, no one is free from this danger, but we have seen that there's a different incentive and a different logic. That can work to also, especially also in companies, by the way, to work against corruption. But that's another question. And thirdly, I would love to see what we have in Ireland, where you have this regularly being used. And once you have a citizens initiative and a citizens assembly, that at least a citizens assembly in Ireland, that you also can then let the citizens vote directly on the proposal, and in a Europe-wide referendum. This, by the way, was the proposal 20 years ago, and the compromise was the ECI. And I think we need to go again into this discussion, which would require more time here, because it's complex. It's a different story to run a Europe-wide referendum compared to a national one, and so on and so on. But I think there's a lot to learn in the meantime, in these 20 years we've had in between, where we can learn to make our system more immune against corporate power with new democratic innovations.
Danke, Carsten. James.
Yeah, I just want to amplify a few things that were said. I mean, the fact that the European Livestock Voice could operate like this, beyond the transparency register, this is a feature. It's not a bug of the way that the EU works. It is, there are sort of, I mean, it's not even mandatory. It's still a sort of voluntary transparency procedure. So that's number one. And number two is that the transparency regime is not really working very well when it comes, for example, to access to documents. The European Ombudsman, who in theory oversees some of that process, she has made it very clear time and time again that the way that the transparency regime is currently working, especially with regards to the European Commission and the European Council, but especially the Commission, this is bad for journalism and it's bad for democracy. A third thing, the sheer volume of meetings that corporate lobbyists have with officials from the European Commission is remarkable when compared with the amount of meetings that civil society groups are granted with European commissioners. I mean, I'm tempted to ask the question, do we need a sort of mandatory minimum of meetings with civil society groups? I personally don't think that, and Carsten, I take on board that the Parliament should have, a much greater role, shall we say, in pushing in oversight role. So I don't want to diminish that, but I personally don't think that parliamentary hearings are enough to put pressure on commissioners, and that is going to be especially true if the predictions are right for the next European Parliament, where we will have more far-right legislators than ever before, some of whom could wind up running the all-important committees. And just as a final thought, and it's come up a number of times, it came up a little bit in what I said, it certainly came up in what Nina had to say. It's something that I discussed with Olga when I was making the podcast. Conflicts of interest in academia and in professional organizations. I don't think Europe wants to fully go down the US path here, where these kind of conflicts of interest are just sort of normalized. So I think that somehow in Europe, perhaps there can be a redoubled effort to try and address that particular problem, because the more that there are these conflicts of interest, the more corporate lobbies can sort of sign up, what look like perfectly neutral academics to effectively support their causes. Thank you.
Danke, James. James, ich will da noch mal nachhaken, weil du hast
Thank you, James. That was interesting. So let me ask, Andrea Betayo was interviewed by you for your podcast, so the representative of that lobby group. And when talking to him in that interview, what was your feeling? Could you feel that he was afraid of something? You know, I'm sure you've got antenna for that. You can put your finger on something that worries him in their strategy. Could you pick out anything like that?
Well, I mean, I think perhaps the main thing was that they were sort of saying that they were just a sort of communications outfit, right? And Andrea was operating as a campaign manager, and that they had no real lobbying role per se. And the work that was done by Lighthouse Reports showed that, in fact, but this is before Andrea joined the group, that European Livestock Voice had organized meetings with the deputy head of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, a couple of years ago, and with the EFSA group that oversees food safety in Europe. So, I mean, they had been operating effectively as a pressure group, as an interest group. So I think that he was very, you know, he that's where he conceded that perhaps they'd been kind of, you know, outside of the expected, you know, what one would expect. So I think that was one element that really worried him. And he was probably just, you know, a little bit afraid that that would be exposed and become a bit of a scandal. So yeah, that's what I would say.
We are actually about to submit a complaint about them. Maybe better late than never. But maybe they'll sign up in the meantime. At least that.
Wunderbar. Okay, sehr spannend. Fand ich jetzt super, die Runde. Wir haben noch mal ganz viel auch.
That's fascinating. We've taken up a lot of the questions already. We still have 10 minutes to go. And I would like to put one more legal question to Thomas, and then I'll raise another very political question, which I consider a very important one. Thomas, we have received a question. Can we not go to the European Court of Justice because the European Commission is not taking up its responsibility? Perhaps you can remind us what is really mandatory within the process of the European Citizens Initiatives. The legally binding point is the self-commitment of the European Commission, the way I understand it. Is that correct? Thomas, perhaps you can enlighten us. Yes. I'm happy to do that. Indeed, there is a possibility if the European Commission does not carry out its responsibilities to take them to court because of inactivity. However, this presupposes, and that is the step we're at, that we have a preliminary sort of proceeding going on, in which the Citizens Committee needs to ask the Commission to become active. Otherwise, we would bring this action for failure to act. So once we have the reply from the European Commission, we can reconsider whether we will bring the action for failure to act. However, at the present, we are still in the preliminaries. It is a possibility. We are very much aware of that possibility, of the legal possibility we have. And then the legally binding character of the ECI process. Let me come back to that. It is true that the European Court of Justice has interpreted it in such a way that the European Commission does not have to become active. However, it is legally binding if the European Commission says itself that it commits to implementing it. And that is a self-commitment, a self-obligation that the European Commission took on, and it will have to be judged by it.
James, is your hand still up from the previous question, or is that a new answer? Your hand is still up.
Ist eine alte, glaube ich.
So okay, so it's still, the hand is still up. Okay, wunderbar. Ja, jetzt mache ich noch die.
So let me come to the final question now. It was a question that was put in various times, and perhaps you can all come in on that. The German question: what does all of this have to do with the farmers' protests? That's something that I mentioned already in the introduction. They don't have any interest in animal welfare or the Green Deal. So who is really steering the protest, and what is the role of the German Farmers Association in all these protests? And that's also a question from Mark of the University of Greifswald. What about the political decisions in the context of the farm to fork strategy? Can we also become more progressive in this area? And so that's a strategic reflection. Animal welfare, how much is that connected to the situation of small farmers or big farmers? I'm sure that many of you have a position on that, but perhaps we can try and see the big picture. So how do the breaches against animal welfare fit into this picture of farming and benefits for farming?
Maybe, yeah, Olga, I knew it.
Okay. Well, I guess you asked many questions here. I will just try to to refer to some of them. In general, we have seen in regards to animal welfare that there is among the farming community, in the farming community, and here I include not just the big meat lobbies, but also small farmers, that there is a lot of hesitation for reform. This is, I can understand this, especially if we are talking about smaller farms and people who are not, let's say, who depend on farming and are looking at the future and are afraid of change. However, most of the industry here, because many of the farms are big farms and are most of animal farming is done industrially, unfortunately, and we have seen that the industry does not want to change its ways. They want to increase profits. They want to keep subsidies, even though many of the subsidies are environmentally are negative for the environment, are negative for people and our communities, and also destructive for the animals. In terms of the so what we see, in a way, to put it in more simple words, is a fight between profits and more profit, increasing profits, and animal welfare. And when I talk about animal welfare, I mean reducing the level of suffering. Citizens have become, as the years go by, have become increasingly aware and increasingly concerned about the level of suffering that we as humans cause to animals. And European citizens want change. This is what this ECI is about. This is what the other ECIs about animals are about. And we need to, as a society, we need to start looking at how the reform via the farm to fork strategy, and hopefully even more ambitious reform in the future, will actually take place, so that we prepare ourselves for a future that is more humane to other sentient beings, and actually a future where the obligation of the European of the Commission and in the treaties, the protection of animal welfare is actually realized and materialized in ways that will cause less suffering to animals, and will actually advance ourselves also in an ethical way, because a lot of times this is something that we don't, as lobbyists, also policymakers, don't like to refer to ethics, and they don't like to bring that picture into the discussion. So yeah, I'll just leave it for here, and I'm sure others have more to say.
Vielen Dank. Dann habe ich jetzt noch Nina und danach dann James.
Thanks very much. I would now like to call on Nina and then James, and then we'll close. Nina.
Yes, thank you. It is a really interesting question. We've also seen it in the Netherlands, and it's extremely ironic or cynical to see how for decades farmers have gone broke. Thousands of farmers have lost their livelihood because of the economic system in which they are pushed. They are indebted. They are dependent on subsidies. They are being squeezed on both sides, both on the agribusiness delivering the inputs and the supermarkets buying their products that want as low price as possible. And the input companies, the pesticide corporations, for instance, they want to get as much as possible money out of the farmers. So they are being put in an increasingly difficult situation. And then it is being spun by conservatives and the right wing as every measure that is taken for the environment or for the farmer's own health or for the soil or for climate is a left-wing hobby or a cultural elite thing that is against ordinary people. So the far right really likes to ignore the role of the economic elite and the role of big corporations, and basically just gives the blame to for instance the Green Deal or Timmermans or any progressive party, and we really have to deal with that and counteract that, and basically show that the situation that farmers are in is due to decades of neglect and liberalization, abandoning of the milk quota, of the sugar quota, no regulation of prices, etc. Now, I think it's difficult to talk about the real factory farms even as farmers, and of course many farmers suffer from the consequences of the fact that we have these huge establishments producing this incredibly cheap meat at the cost of the environment and animal welfare. So we kind of have to. It's difficult to talk about farmers as a group, and we also have to see clearly that while Copa Cogeca is by far the dominant voice in Brussels, there are other farmer organizations like Via Campesina, the European Milk Board, and we really need to bring forward their voice because they have different views. They are much more open and very supportive of producing in a sustainable way and in a way that is much more respectful for animals. So yeah, I would really would like to stress those few things, that we really need to do everything we can to make visible how the agribusiness is basically exploiting farmers, and how most of the farmers are also victims of this system. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Danke, Nina. Das ist auch was wenn man hier.
Thanks very much, Nina. That's something, if you listen very closely to what the farmers say in Germany nowadays, it's exactly what they are saying. It's not quite so homogeneous as it's being depicted very often. It's a debate that we need to have, all these points that you mentioned. James, please.
Yes, I just quickly, Maximilian, you asked about politics, and as Nina said earlier, and I agree with this, that the center right is very scared of losing votes to the extreme right, and is trying to ally itself with farmers, so they move in that direction. But this has a particular kind of European complexion when it comes to how all of that's playing out in Brussels. The Conservatives, the European People's Party, which is basically run by the German CDU, they need new membership since Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party of Hungary left that group. So, of all the political forces in Brussels, it's really the European People's Party that is poised to. It really wants to benefit from the support of farmers and new farming groups. And interestingly, if I have this right, the farmer citizen movement in the Netherlands, the BBB, I think they have officially joined the EPP. So,
yes,
maybe that strategy is working. And then the same kind of logic may partly be what's at work with Commission President von der Leyen's decision to agree to put the European Citizens Initiative in the deep freeze the way that she did. It's noteworthy that she didn't even mention any of this stuff in her State of the Union speech. Instead, she almost sang a hymn of praise to farmers in her State of the Union speech. It was quite an odd moment in some ways, and and I think this is something I discussed with Olga. I mean, perhaps she did that partly to ensure her renomination to her position in Brussels by Berlin. So the next time you hear talk of rural revolt from the right or from conservatives, think too about the way that they perhaps want to benefit a little bit from that kind of sense that there is a revolt out there. They certainly want to harness that. Let's put it that way.
Dankeschön. Ja, das hat natürlich auch ganz viele politische Punkte noch.
Yes, thank you. There are lots of political hints in there, and we could continue our discussion. I can see people have been dropping off. I think we all deserve a break. Let's leave it at that. Today it was very interesting. Max thanks the interpreters. The interpreters very much enjoyed working for you. Thank you for listening. So we started with the agricultural policy and politics in the EU, and it certainly was not the last webinar. There are plans on our side to continue down that path and take a closer look at what's happening. So we've been getting in touch with the industry, with the their lobbyists, and we would like to hear from them. We hope that we can have you on board again. You hear from us by email. I've just posted a link. Europe Calling exists because we have crowdfunding. If you have a few euros to spare, or whatever currency, that'll be a great help for us, because you help us keep democracy alive. You help us keep people participating. 246 people already sponsoring or supporting us, and let me kindly invite you to do the same, and hope to see you in a few weeks with our next webinar on agriculture. See you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.